Bedding lies in a heap just inside the doorway, arranged not by sleep but by force. From beneath it, legs extended naturally, still bound at the ankles with white cord. No sound follows, no movement, only the weight of a moment that has already passed. Portsmouth is awake now, unaware that one of its young residents has been silenced during the night. Whatever entered that apartment did not rush, it did not leave cleanly. It left questions that would outlive witnesses, evidence, even the man who first stepped back into the hallway and reached for his radio. Some stories do not ask for attention, they wait for it. And if you choose to follow this one to its end, stay close. P1. Investigation Phase 1. By mid-morning, crime scene tape cut across Chapel Street, drawing a thin boundary between daily life and what lay inside Unit Number 2. The victim was identified as Laura Kempton, 23 years old. She lived alone. She was a student at Portsmouth Beauty School. She worked 2 jobs downtown. She had gone out the night before and come home. Detective William Mortimer arrived shortly after the initial call. He had spent decades with the Portsmouth Police Department and had learned to read rooms before touching anything inside them. Laura's apartment showed immediate signs of violence. Furniture displaced, drawers pulled open, clothing and paper scattered across the floor. Blood marked the walls in upward streaks, as if momentum itself had been recorded. Laura's body was found beneath a mattress and box spring, piled over her as if to hide what could not be erased. She was nude. A gray telephone cord was wrapped around her neck. A green pillowcase covered her face. When it was removed, the damage was unmistakable. Massive head trauma. Facial injuries so severe they distorted recognition. Nearby, a wine bottle lay on the floor, its presence too deliberate to ignore. The medical examiner would later confirm the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with repeated strikes. There were also clear indicators of sexual assault. Semen was recovered from multiple locations: vaginal swabs, skin scrapings, and the telephone cord itself. Time of death was estimated between 1:30 and 3:30 a.m. The door told its own story. The upper left panel had been removed, not smashed. A small black metal hook, torn from a hallway mailbox, was recovered nearby. Mortimer believed it had been used as a tool inserted through the opening to pry away molding, then maneuvered around the inner frame to unlock the door from the inside. Quiet, methodical, no forced entry in the traditional sense. If you have thoughts about how someone could enter a locked apartment without waking neighbors, this is a moment to leave them below. Interviews began immediately. Friends described Laura as outgoing, social, deeply comfortable in the city she had moved to just a year earlier. She locked her door carefully. She double-checked it. This detail came from the last man known to have been intimate with her, identified publicly only as Junior. He told investigators they had spent the early morning hours together, had breakfast downtown, and parted so she could go to work. He cooperated fully. His account was consistent, and later his DNA would exclude him entirely. Witnesses placed Laura alive in her apartment around 1:30 a.m. A teenage boy across the street saw her seated on her couch, her back to the window, holding something small in her hand. About 30 minutes later, a neighbor returned home and noticed the hallway light was out. He saw the missing door panel. He heard noises from inside the apartment and assumed someone was repairing damage. The light bulb, investigators later found, had been loosened. Money was missing. A cash envelope Laura had placed on her kitchen table earlier that day was gone. Nothing else of clear value appeared targeted. The scene suggested interruption rather than planning, control rather than panic. As the apartment was processed and evidence logged, one conclusion settled in quietly among the detectives: whoever had entered Chapel Street that night had done so with purpose, had stayed longer than necessary, and had left behind more than violence. In the days following the murder, Portsmouth settled into an uneasy rhythm. Patrol patterns were adjusted. Plainclothes officers lingered near downtown bars. Tips came in steadily, then slowed. Nothing outwardly unusual announced itself. What unsettled investigators instead were the small inconsistencies, details that resisted alignment. The hallway light outside Laura's apartment became one of them. The bulb had not burned out. It had been loosened just enough to fail. Anyone entering the building late at night would have done so in partial darkness, guided more by memory than sight. It suggested familiarity, or at least confidence. Yet no neighbor reported seeing anyone unusual enter or leave during the estimated window of death. The door panel raised similar questions. Removing it required time and precision, not brute force. There were no splintered edges, no panic marks. Whoever worked the molding free did so quietly, deliberately, then left the panel behind. The metal hook found near the body bent, unremarkable, should not have been there at all. It belonged to the building, not to Laura. Its presence was a clue that felt intentional and careless at the same time. Then there was the cigarette. Laura did not smoke. No ashtray in the apartment held similar butts. The brand could not be conclusively traced to anyone she knew. It sat near the body as if dropped without thought, yet it remained untouched by any attempt to clean the scene. It was an intrusion without explanation. Investigators reviewed timelines repeatedly. Laura was last seen alive around 1:30 a.m. Sounds were heard around 2 o'clock by morning. The apartment was silent. No neighbors reported screams. The building's construction should have carried noise easily. That absence became its own presence. Radio logs from that night showed nothing remarkable, no calls, no disturbances nearby. Yet one officer later remarked that the city felt flat during the early hours, unusually quiet for a Saturday night. This was not evidence, it was an impression. Still, it lingered. Mortimer's team mapped Laura's movements in the weeks before her death. Bars, work shifts, class schedules, repetition without pattern. No threats, no arguments overheard, no reported stalking. Her social life was wide, but not chaotic. She was known, she was visible, and yet nothing pointed cleanly toward a suspect. The semen samples became a focal point. In 1981, DNA analysis was still years away from practical use. Investigators could only note that the biological evidence did not align neatly with Laura's known relationships. JR's account placed him with Laura earlier, not later. The timeline suggested someone else entirely. Search efforts expanded outward from Chapel Street. Officers canvassed nearby buildings, alleyways, and businesses. They looked for discarded clothing, tools, anything out of place. Nothing surfaced. The city gave back only what it had already shown. As weeks passed, detectives began to notice another pattern, not in the evidence, but in the questions from the public. People asked whether this was random, whether someone had been watching, whether the city was safe at night. Mortimer avoided speculation. He returned to the physical facts again and again, as if repetition might force them to confess. What disturbed him most was not what was found, but what was not. No clear path in, no clear path out. No witness who could say, with certainty, that they had seen another human presence cross Laura Kempton's threshold that night. If this case holds your attention so far, take a moment to acknowledge it with a like. Stories like this persist only because they are followed. Laura Kempton was 23 years old, but the numbers do little to describe how fully she occupied space. Friends remembered her height first, then her posture, upright, confident, almost practiced. She had a strong jaw, expressive eyes, and a habit of making rooms feel louder simply by entering them. Portsmouth had not intimidated her. It had attracted her. She grew up across the bay in Durham, close enough to visit Portsmouth often before she ever lived there. When she moved in 1980, it felt intentional. A ground-floor apartment near school, walking distance to work, music, clubs, late nights that blurred into early mornings. She was 6 months away from finishing beauty school, close enough to see a future forming, not yet close enough to protect it. Laura worked where tourists passed through: an ice cream parlor, a novelty gift shop, jobs that required patience, performance, a public face. She knew how to read people. She liked crowds. She liked dancing. She dated, but did not anchor herself to anyone. Those who knew her described freedom as her defining trait. The night she died was not an exception to her routine. She went out with a friend. They ate, danced, talked. Men noticed her. She noticed some of them back. When she returned home around 1 a.m., nothing in her behavior suggested fear or urgency. She said goodnight at her front steps. She went inside alone. Inside that apartment were ordinary signs of a young woman's life: school materials, clothing in rotation, small plans not yet acted on. On her kitchen table earlier that day, she had placed cash in an envelope, money set aside for something practical: rent, utilities, a future obligation. It was a quiet gesture toward stability. JR would later recall how careful she was with her door, how she locked it even for brief absences, how she asked him to check it before bed. These details mattered because they contradicted the simplest explanation. Laura did not invite danger casually. If someone entered her apartment after she was alone, they did so against her will or without her knowledge. The violence inflicted on her was not quick. It involved restraint. It involved effort. The injuries indicated repeated blows, delivered with enough force to change the structure of bone. The wine bottle was not something brought in from outside. It was taken from within her space and turned against her. Laura did not leave a message. She did not make a call. The telephone cord that wrapped her neck was never used to dial for help. Whether she was silenced immediately or overwhelmed too fast to react is something the evidence cannot answer. In the end, what remains of Laura Kempton in the record are fragment statements, photographs, forensic reports. They outline a life interrupted but do not explain why it was chosen. That question would remain open for decades, waiting for something beyond memory to speak. For nearly 2 decades, Laura Kempton's case existed in a state of controlled stasis. Evidence was preserved. Leads were revisited. Names were added, then crossed out. The biological material recovered in 1981 remained silent, its significance ahead of its time. What investigators had could not yet speak with precision. That began to change in 2000, and samples from Laura's body were submitted for modern testing. The results were incomplete, but suggestive. A partial male DNA profile emerged from skin scrapings. It did not belong to anyone already eliminated. 2 years later, further testing produced a full male profile from the vaginal swabs, and a partial profile from the cigarette butt found near her body. The profiles matched each other. They did not match Junior. The assumption that the last consensual partner must explain the evidence collapsed entirely. This created a contradiction investigators could not ignore. The unknown male DNA was present in multiple locations, including an item Laura would not have handled herself. Yet no witness placed an unknown man with her after 1:30 a.m. The evidence indicated intimacy and violence, but the timeline resisted easy reconstruction. Over the next decade, Portsmouth police compared the DNA against hundreds of individuals. Each comparison closed a door without opening another. The case aged. Detectives retired. One of them, William Mortimer, would pass away in 2019, never knowing the name tied to the evidence he had protected. In 2021, the case changed direction. Genetic genealogy, once experimental, now proven, offered a new method. The preserved samples were sent for reanalysis and uploaded to a public genealogy database. The approach did not search for the perpetrator directly. It searched for family. The match came quickly. Within days, a close relative appeared in the database. Genealogists traced lineages, births, and records backward and forward until the possibilities narrowed to one individual. There was only one biological child who fit the parameters. His name was Ronnie James Lee. The discovery carried an immediate complication. Ronnie James Lee had been dead for nearly 20 years. He had overdosed in 2005. There would be no arrest, no trial, no interrogation, only confirmation. Investigators located a preserved blood card from Lee's autopsy. When it was tested against the DNA recovered from Laura Kempton, the match was exact. The evidence that had waited for decades had finally found its source. Lee had lived in Portsmouth, 1981. He worked as a security guard. He was 8 minutes by car from Chapel Street. In the years following Laura's murder, he accumulated arrests for burglary. In one case, he entered a residence by breaking a panel and unlocking the door from the inside. In 1987, he was convicted of burglary and sexual assault in another New Hampshire town. The pattern, once invisible, now aligned. At a press conference in July 2023, the Attorney General of New Hampshire named Ronnie James Lee as Laura Kempton's killer. The conclusion was delivered without spectacle. Beyond a reasonable doubt. Case closed. And yet, not everything resolved cleanly. Lee's death meant motives would remain inferred, not spoken. Questions about other victims, particularly Tammy Little, remained officially unanswered. Evidence existed. Connections suggested themselves. But confirmation, once again, waited. If you have thoughts on how certainty can arrive long after accountability disappears, leave them quietly below. Years after the press conference, Chapel Street looks unchanged. The building still stands. The sidewalk still curves where it always did. There is no marker for what happened inside Unit Number 2, only the quiet understanding that something permanent occurred there. Even if nothing visible remains. Laura Kempton's case is now labeled solved. A name has been attached. A narrative has been closed. But resolution is not the same as restoration. The person responsible was never questioned, never confronted with photographs, timelines, or the weight of another life. He carried his answers into the ground, leaving investigators to reconstruct intention from fragments. The science arrived late, but it arrived intact. Evidence waited patiently while methods caught up. In that sense, the case did what few do: it endured long enough to speak. And if you want to follow more stories where time itself becomes part of the investigation, this is where you quietly subscribe, without ceremony. Yet the edges of the story remain blurred. Another young woman, another ground floor apartment, another fall night. 1 year later, no official linkage, no public confirmation, only preserved samples, still sealed, still silent, waiting for a similar convergence of patience and technology. Cold cases do not disappear. They settle. They embed themselves into cities, into records, into families who learn to live with unanswered questions. Sometimes science exhumes the truth. Sometimes it only sharpens the outline of what was already feared. Laura Kempton did not vanish. She was taken, in a place she believed was secure, by someone who blended into the ordinary structure of the city around her. And some doors, once opened, never truly close.